My name is Kara Wood. They asked me to do this today primarily because the other people that they asked that are actually qualified were not available, so you have me. They did specifically ask me to bring levity to the day, because I think when you're talking about things called, the Peril of Flood Act, right, you need some levity. You also need martinis, which we don't have because we're on a government budget, but we'll have to survive with coffee and water. But they asked me to do this today because I have the pleasure in my career of having worn a number of hats. If you'll read my bio, I have a background in architecture. I moved to the city of Fort Pierce in 2005, and I worked for the city planning department for a couple of years as a urban designer, urban planner, and then a planning supervisor. And then I moved to St. Lucie County for work. And so I've been engaged as a public sector planner for about 15 years now. So I have that background as a civil servant. But then I also am co-owner of High Tide, which is a boat lift manufacturing company that located in the city of Fort Pierce in 1992. I own that company with my brother. It's a family business. And so I also have the hat of business owner, right? We have about 50 employees. We sell primarily all up the East Coast of the United States and in the Caribbean. We have about a dealer network of about 200. So obviously I'm personally interested, and as a business owner, I'm interested in the future of the coastline of Florida primarily and our country. And then, I'm a citizen of the city of Fort Pierce, right? This is a coastal community. So there's a number of hats, I'm really interested from a number of perspectives on this issue of resiliency. So throughout the day, I think, the organizers of this conference were hoping that I could just sprinkle in those different perspectives on the issue, because we do have a number of different viewpoints from which to approach this. So that's why I'm leading you through this today. And so we're here to talk about resilience. There's, in this rolling slideshow, at the beginning you saw some language talking about resilience. The speakers who are going to be presenting to you today have a number of different viewpoints. They come from different communities who've done some resilience planning. Each community has its own unique concerns and characteristics and risks and liabilities and assets. So you'll get a broad context throughout the day of what resilience means. But I did want you to start just, to have it in the back of your mind, offering a couple of other definitions to consider. One definition from the Community and Regional Resilience Institute says that resilience is the ability to anticipate risk, limit impact, and bounce back rapidly through survival, adaptability, evolution, and growth in the face of turbulent change. Another definition taken from a presidential executive order says resilience means the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions, and withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruption. So these are some really broad language that, when I read these definitions, I think that could apply to a number of different things. I want a resilience plan for my business, right? I want to be able to bounce back if the market goes suddenly in a direction that I didn't anticipate, or really, kind of more importantly, that sort of dials home. I want a resilience plan for my life. As a human being, I want to be able to do these things, right? So there's lots of different ways, I think, to relate this really broad topic. Now, primarily today, we're going to be talking about resilience in the context of, the possibility of sea level rise and flooding and storm surge and things like that. But there are broader reaches to those issues as we think about them being applied to our communities. So we're going to start off the day from the perspective of the Army Corps of Engineers and what they've been doing for the last many years to plan for the future of their resources. So we have Colonel Alan Dodd presenting his experience on this topic. Thank you.
Good morning, and I was kind of surprised when I was asked to come and give this presentation. I retired in 2015, and I've been working in Fort Lauderdale and Miami for the last several years. And so I thought this would be great to talk about what we're doing for resilience, and they're like, no, we want to talk about the Army and the Corps. So I will try and give you my perspective of 20 years of seeing resilience evolve in the military and the changes that they're making. If you look at the military and the Army, it's a very, very large, complex organization, and it doesn't change very easily. We used to like to say 240 years of tradition unmarred by progress. Because The planning processes and the budget systems that they have were developed after World War II and the Cold War. And as we were trying to change how we do business, it's very, very stubborn people who don't want to change anything. But I think that when you look at resilience in the military and what we needed to do after 9/11, we needed to become a stronger organization, to become a more resilient organization. And we learned that resilience is not just a buzzword, but it's something that we had to do in order to be successful. So I'll start out with every organization has a mission statement, and this is the mission statement for the Army Corps of Engineers. When you look at the Army, it's 1.36 million soldiers, another 800,000 in the reserves, $680 billion budget. It has 800 bases, over 70 countries. It's a very large, complex organization. And when you say, well, we're going to do resilience, you have to take into account all of those soldiers, all of those installations, and figure out how you can make a policy that will work for everyone. And it's much more than just winning the nation's wars, and that's what the Army likes to say. Our job is we win the nation's wars. But when you look at the Army Corps of Engineers statement, it involves not only national security and supporting warfighters overseas, but providing emergency response after disasters, economic security and the ports and the rivers, providing for dam safety and coastal protection to protect the communities. The Corps of Engineers is responsible for more than 900 miles of coastline in Florida alone, and it takes those responsibilities very seriously. One of the biggest responsibilities they have is taking care of the soldiers and the families on the installations and the bases who have to go out and do that work. And so resilience becomes a huge part of what we're doing to protect those soldiers, to protect them. After 9/11, we had a lot of soldiers going through issues because we weren't preparing them properly for war. And we saw that in Vietnam as well. It became the #1 priority of the Army is to make a more resilient soldier. And there's a series of organizations and groups led by several generals who do nothing more than focus on resilience of soldiers. When you're doing it, nothing in this is political. They have to go back to research, facts, numbers, and really come up with some good concepts of how to make risk-informed decisions. And that's how the process have changed to really incorporate risk information to make the best possible decisions. So, as I said, it's been changing over 20 years in the military, starting with 9/11, but really it's been evolving in the military for 240 years. You never have enough resources, you never have enough time to do everything you need to do. And so as we were looking at resilience, we started with the soldiers, and that quickly evolved to not only do we need to make our soldiers stronger, but we need to take care of our families better on those installations. We need to make them better communities to support what we're doing. The installations are a platform for everything that we do. And so you have to look at the natural disasters, man-made disasters, economic and social impacts of the decisions as we're changing how we would change the organization. And I would say in your community, it will be different as well. When you look at all the different aspects of what resilience can be, you need to decide what applies to your community, and for the Army, what applied to our bases and our installations. And sometimes it will be more on the environmental, and sometimes it's more on the social aspects to take care of the needs. So, but again, we focused in 2 areas. The first one is resilience training, dealing with soldiers, and the second part is dealing with how to make our bases stronger. Okay, so this is a slide that came from one of the presentations that the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installations, Energy and Environment put together, which is really from a forum talking about how to make better communities and better bases. Okay, and just to give you one example, Fort Bragg, where I spent a lot of my time, it's got 50,000 soldiers assigned to it, 200,000 family members or civilians who work there. It's 19 square miles, and it has everything from schools to water and wastewater treatment plants to basically industrial areas. It is just like a small city. When you're looking at how do you operate a base like that, you need to consider your environmental resources that you have. Endangered species, archaeological resources, in a lot of our bases dealing with tribal issues, and then how do you incorporate military training and all the things that the Army has to do to support its warfighting missions. We had a huge challenge as we're trying to improve those bases on how to cut the expenses associated with running the base, make them more efficient, and at the same time ensure that if something happens, I was at Fort Bragg, got hit by a hurricane, and the base shut down for 2 weeks just trying to recover. That's 2 weeks that soldiers weren't training, 2 weeks that soldiers weren't able to deploy and do the work that they needed to do. So how do we make that base more resilient? And then how do we cut the costs through innovative means? And a lot of communities talk a lot about P3s, public-private partnerships. The military has been a leader on trying to come up with innovative ways to reduce its costs and still accomplish the things that it needs to do. And finally, how do you replace aging and failing technology, infrastructure, and bring it up to current standards and make it hardened and stronger for the needs of the future? So this document is the strategy that came out. It's called the 2025 Strategy for the Base of the Future. And really, as the military is looking, this is just one of several documents that comes out every couple of years. It's looking at what do we need for the next 75 to 100 years. And I would say if you think about the leaders who were here in St. Lucie in 1919, as they were trying to make the same decisions that you're facing today, you can't predict what the future will call. You will not know what St. Lucie will look like 100 years from now. But the decisions that you're making are going to set the path for what that future will look like, what you will become over the course of those 100 years. So in the military's case, it was trying to decide what functions do we need to have on base, how do we relate with the communities outside the base, and share opportunities to take care of families and increase our readiness. And a lot of times this really means looking at new technologies, new practices on how to do business. The military can't do everything just on the base, but it needs to partner with outside communities. And so as the Army engineers, our chief at the time, Lieutenant General Todd Semonite, came up with these 3 focuses for how the Army will rebuild its platforms for readiness, its installations. We spend $1.3 billion on energy use. They use 41 billion gallons of water every year, generate 2.3 million tons of solid waste, and generate more than 9.3 metric tons of greenhouse gases. And they needed to reduce all of that. And so they came through a series of deliberate planning processes to really focus in these 3 areas. The first one is on efficiency on the bases. About 5 years ago, they kicked off what they called the Net Zero Initiative with a goal to reduce down to net zero energy use, water use, and waste use on the installations. They have 9 installations that were targeted to begin with. They were very successful on those, and now they've opened up the program to the rest of the world, to those other 800 bases. As they're doing it, they're looking at cogeneration opportunities, clean energy sources, and then as they're trying to reduce the costs, energy saving performance contracts and utility service contracts to reduce their overall costs. As they're building facilities, they made a conscious decision. We can't just go bottom line cheap cost in facilities. So they established a minimum LEED standard for every building that is constructed within the Army, and they spent a lot of time working on standardized designs that could be used worldwide. That helped to reduce the design time, it helped to improve the standards of the facilities, and provide an overall better environment for the soldiers and the families who would be living there. And finally, resilience. We can't just look at the basic needs, but really trying to look at what resilience meant to the military and how do we build those resilient features into our bases, our installations. So as we're talking about resilience, and as they're trying to incorporate it, they needed to put together a plan on how to become resilient. And again, resilience isn't a separate document, but they needed a roadmap to get to how they would change their processes. So in 2015, the Army Corps of Engineers came out with the initial resilience roadmap, which has been changed 2 or 3 times since then. But really, it's focused on how do we protect against all hazards, natural and human-caused, in order to prepare for, adapt to changing conditions, and withstand and recover from disruptions. And that came right out of the document. Really, a lot of this came from lessons learned during Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, and other experience that we had where we didn't do as well as we thought we needed to do. Okay, and really, the Army needs to focus more holistically in what it's doing, and not just building projects separately. During Hurricane Katrina, a lot of the damages and the cause of the disaster was the levee systems that were built piecemeal over the course of 25 years. And even though they operated properly as a project, they didn't operate well as a system. And so looking at how do we change the way we build things to make sure that we're not having unexpected consequences later on. And so this is one of the concepts that they really have been pushing in the planning and design process for installations, and the Corps uses now for all of its civil works projects. It is really using a systems approach, looking at 3 different levels. When you build the projects individually, they need to be built in a resilient factor, really looking at the components and the parts of the project itself to make sure that we won't have failures or issues later on, taking into account future conditions 50 to 100 years in the future. As you're building those projects, they need to work together, though, with other projects that the Corps has built, or with other features or projects that communities may have built. And that's where you need to look at the overall system and how it works together. You know, and that is where the boundaries sometimes do not work too well, but we need to make sure that as we're building features in one city, that it complements the features that are being built in another city, so that it does work as an overall system. And finally, all of these systems, when you put them together, a system of systems, they become the community, and that's where you're looking at what's the overall impact of all your projects, whether it's housing, infrastructure, or natural features, parks. How do they come together to support the overall community? Because at the end of the day, it's all about taking care of the people who live there and supporting their lives, trying to improve the quality of life and making a more resilient community. And so the Corps is trying to change its business processes to match this. In true military fashion, you have to have principles and strategies. So the Corps came up with these 4 principles that really address the life cycle of projects. Start out with preparing. You have to prepare for what you think will happen, to identify what your risks are, and then taking steps, whether it's stockpiling materials, building projects to anticipate and to deal with those risks as they happen. You can't build to prevent anything from happening. When a Category 5 storm comes in, you will have some type of damages and impacts. So recognizing where there will be and having the ability to absorb shocks in certain places versus having a hardline protection up front. And then knowing afterwards, after the event occurs, how you're going to be able to go in and quickly recover from those type of impacts. And finally, it's a constant learning process. We have infrastructure in place that's been here for 50 years, and it's going to be here for another 50 to 100 years. So how do we adapt it and learn from the lessons that we've made so that the next time that event happens, the impacts will not be quite as severe? And so the Corps spent a lot of time talking about what really are the qualities of resilience and how do we change our way of thinking in order to adapt to the new future. Okay, they recognize that there's a lot of stubbornness, but we need to overcome it. So these are some of the approaches that were part of the discussions, and this slide came right out of the campaign to go out and develop or train the leaders within the Corps to change their process and their way of thinking. But how do you become more proactive in planning for disasters versus just reacting to it? And really this is about, for the Corps, changing the planning and the design process. As you're building the features, looking at how can it be more sustainable versus just sacrificial. You know, and when I say sustainable, I mean looking at how sturdy do you build it to withstand that shock versus the time it will take to how long it will take to rebuild it afterwards, and accepting the trade-offs in costs and impacts. Adaptive versus static, looking at what do you need to do for today versus how much flexibility do you need to build into it for tomorrow. And again, when they build a barracks or they build a motor pool, they're building it for what they think they need today, but if you build a little bit more in it, you build the bays a little bit wider, the structures, it gives you a lot more flexibility in the future when you need to change the purpose of that building or that structure. And finally, risk analysis is probably one of the biggest parts where the Corps has been changing its processes. Really, they've gone from a deterministic approach to just calculating what's the risk of Herbert Hoover Dike breaking and flooding an area to what's the probability of areas and the impacts of it, and how do we become more holistic in our planning. And so I've listed a number of different ideas that they have tried to incorporate, but again, it's all about changing the mindset in how they do business. And the last thing is, you can have a lot of great principles and ideas on what you want to do, but you have to be able to implement it. And so they came up with 3 basic strategies on how to change their way of doing business. The first one is evolving the standards and criteria to make sure that resilience is a part of everything they do. And that is where we're going through in more standardized designs, really looking at what your end state is, what you want to be able to produce, and then permeating it throughout the entire organization. Supporting community resilience. The federal government is great at doing things the way they want to do it, but every project that we built impacts communities, and we need to build it in conjunction with communities. And so you should be seeing a lot more public meetings, a lot more exchanges on the standards in Corps projects, because they want it to be a partnership in planning and design of projects. And the last thing is really focusing on the priority areas, recognizing that you can't do everything at once, you can't afford to do it, but you really need to identify your priorities and then focus on them. And the Army and the Corps are really trying to stay within those key areas and focus on succeeding in the areas that matter most. And so finally, I would say as you're looking at what you're trying to do here, don't take the short approach, really look long-term and set an example for what you think right would be like. Take the systems approach, looking at efficiency, sustainability, and really how projects are interrelated and can work together when you look at the bigger picture to produce what you need to do for your communities. You know, financial resources are really tight. In Miami, we face that all the time. But as you look at partnerships, P3s, other ways to do financing, either through grants or loans, you can do a lot more than if you just look at what you have for funding within your budgets. Sharing lessons learned is a huge part of the Corps' process. They've made so many mistakes and failures over the course of 100 years, and they try to learn from every single one of those and make sure they don't repeat that mistake again. And the more you share with other communities on the good and the bad, the better everybody will be at the end of the day. And finally, leadership starts at the top, and it really will take you as the leaders in the community to be relentless about pushing your initiatives forward and making it happen. In the Corps, we say, leaders lead and followers will follow. You're the leaders. We follow our generals wherever they tell us to go because we know that they're taking us down the right path. And so finally, I started by talking about there was two parts to resilience. And I focused mostly on the installation, but I would like to leave with the soldier part of resilience. And this was one of my soldiers in Afghanistan, 2010. Adam Keyes was the only survivor of a 1,500-pound IED and spent about 5 years in the hospital. He was a triple amputee, but he was determined to overcome that. Last year in October, he climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, and now he is on a very successful career as a stand-up comedian. I know, it's kind of ironic, but he is the most resilient person I've ever met, and if you can do it at the individual level, if the Army can do it at the macro level, we can all be resilient. But it's just every day do something to become a better community, and you'll be successful. So I hope this helps, and I hope you have a wonderful day today with a very successful workshop. So thank you very much.